After confronting my husband's mistress, who was pregnant, in public, 2 days later, she suffered a miscarriage. After that, my husband and his mistress cruelly framed me and sent me to prison. For 1 full year, while I was behind bars, every time my husband and his mistress came to visit me, I refused to see them. I would not welcome demons into my life. And on the day I was finally released, I made sure that same day would be the day they lost everything. Before the story begins, please write in the comments section where you're watching the story from. Don't forget to like and subscribe so the Midnight Stories channel can continue to grow and bring you even more gripping stories. The smartphone on the dining table vibrated loudly, shattering the calm of what was usually a peaceful morning in the large house. Sabrina Miller, who had just finished setting the table, glanced at the screen. A banking notification had just come in. Her brow furrowed when she saw the amount. $1,600 had just been withdrawn from a special savings account. That wasn't their household account. It was her late mother's pilgrimage savings account, money Sabrina had guarded with extreme care. Her heart began to race. She knew exactly where the debit card for that account was kept, inside a wallet locked in the small safe in her husband's study. Richard Miller. Sabrina had never given permission to anyone to touch that money, especially not Richard, who lately had been using business cash flow problems as an excuse far too often. Without hesitation, Sabrina called Richard's number. The first call went unanswered. The second was rejected immediately. The suspicion she had been suppressing for months finally exploded. She opened the family location tracking app they had installed years ago. Richard's location appeared clearly, a luxury shopping mall downtown, inside a premium baby and maternity store. Sabrina's breath caught in her throat. Her worst fears about Richard's recent behavior, coming home late, hiding his phone, suddenly made sense. Her mother's sacred savings were being spent in a baby store. They had been married for 5 years. They had no children. Sabrina grabbed her car keys and sped through the crowded streets of New York City, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Tears filled her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She was not a weak woman who cried before seeing the truth with her own eyes. She remembered how her father had once trusted Richard to protect her and to run the family corporation. That trust had now been betrayed in the most painful way imaginable. At the mall, Sabrina walked quickly and decisively toward the baby store. Through the large glass display window, she saw everything clearly. There was Richard, her husband, laughing freely, a smile he hadn't shown her in a long time. Beside him stood a young woman gently caressing her visibly pregnant belly. Sabrina recognized her instantly. Fiona Adams, Richard's former secretary from his previous company, once introduced as nothing more than a capable colleague. Richard's arm was wrapped lovingly around Fiona's waist. With his other hand, he handed over a gold-colored debit card, the one that belonged to her late mother, to the cashier. Sabrina's blood boiled. She no longer cared about manners or the reputation of a respectable family she had spent years protecting. She stormed into the store, her gaze sharp and blazing. The chime above the door rang. Richard and Fiona turned around. The color drained from Richard's face as if he had seen a ghost. Fiona, however, looked completely unfazed. She tightened her grip on Richard's arm, openly challenging Sabrina. Sabrina stood directly in front of them, her breathing heavy but her voice controlled, though her heart was shattered. She asked what her husband was doing there with her mother's money. Richard stammered, offering a clumsy excuse about buying a gift for a client. Sabrina wasn't stupid. She pointed at Fiona's belly and asked whose child that was. Before Richard could answer, Fiona cut in, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. She said there was no point hiding it anymore. She would soon give Richard the child Sabrina never could. The words hit Sabrina like a slap. The humiliation was public. Store employees stood frozen. Other shoppers whispered as phones were raised to record. Sabrina snapped. She grabbed Fiona's arm, demanding she let go of her husband. The pull wasn't hard, just the reflex of a betrayed wife. But Fiona was a master actress. She screamed hysterically as if she had been brutally attacked, stumbling backward and knocking over a display of baby bottles that crashed loudly onto the floor. She screamed for help, accusing Sabrina of harming her unborn child. A crowd gathered. Phones recorded everything. Panicked, Richard shoved Sabrina's shoulder harshly, shouting her to stop making a scene and go home. He defended Fiona, calling Sabrina a crazy, jealous woman. Sabrina's heart broke completely. Her husband was choosing his mistress over her wife. She looked at Richard, her eyes filled with pain and disappointment, picked up the debit card from the counter, snapped it in half in front of him, and walked away. She held her head high, though the tears finally fell once she was inside her car. 2 days passed. Sabrina locked herself inside the house. Richard never came home. She believed the marriage was over and prepared herself for divorce. She sought peace through prayer and quiet reflection, thinking this would be settled in family court. She was terribly wrong. Richard and Fiona had planned something far more evil. That night at 11 p.m., loud pounding echoed through the front door. Sabrina opened it cautiously. 2 police officers stood there, along with Richard, his face cold and emotionless. One officer presented an arrest warrant. Sabrina was being charged with aggravated assault resulting in fetal death. She shook her head in disbelief, insisting she had never touched Fiona's stomach, only her arm. Richard stepped forward, looked her straight in the eyes, and coldly stated that Fiona had suffered severe bleeding after being pushed. That afternoon, the doctor confirmed she had miscarried. Sabrina's world collapsed. The accusation was monstrous. She was handcuffed as neighbors watched with judgmental eyes. That night, she slept not in her bed, but on a cold bench at the police station, labeled a suspect in the death of her husband's unborn child. Under the harsh interrogation lights, Sabrina repeated the truth over and over. But witnesses, store customers, somehow all testified against her. CCTV footage was malfunctioning. Everything had been arranged. A lawyer hired by Richard's family arrived, not to defend her, but to pressure her to confess for a lighter sentence. She refused. She would not admit to a crime she never committed. Days later, Sabrina sat in the courtroom wearing a prison uniform, her face bare of makeup, yet still carrying traces of dignity. The courtroom was packed, and this was only the beginning. The mainstream media covered the case relentlessly, splashing it across headlines that painted Sabrina Miller as a jealous wife turned cold-blooded killer. Talk shows, tabloids, and online news portals repeated the same narrative over and over, shaping public opinion long before the verdict was read. The courtroom doors swung open. Fiona Adams was wheeled in on a wheelchair. Her face was deathly pale, her eyes swollen as if from endless crying, her body wrapped entirely in black. The performance was flawless. She looked like the most tragic woman in the world. The trial began with the reading of the charges. The prosecutor portrayed Sabrina as an inhuman monster, a woman driven by envy and rage, devoid of empathy. Then came the false witnesses. One by one, they delivered carefully rehearsed lies, each story more convincing than the last. Then it was Richard Miller's turn. He stood at the witness stand, occasionally wiping away crocodile tears. He told the judge that Sabrina had always had a violent temper and had repeatedly threatened Fiona if they ever crossed paths. He even apologized to the court for failing to educate his wife properly. Every word Richard spoke sliced into Sabrina's heart like a blade. She lowered her head, whispering prayers under her breath, begging God for strength so she would not collapse right there in the courtroom. The climax came when Fiona testified. With a trembling voice and carefully staged sobs, she spoke of how deeply she had loved her unborn child. She accused Sabrina of glaring at her with murderous intent before attacking her. In the middle of the trial, Fiona suddenly screamed hysterically, demanding to know how Sabrina could be so cruel as to kill her own husband's flesh and blood. The judge had to strike the gavel several times to restore order. Sabrina's lawyer remained silent. No objections, no real defense. Every lie was allowed to harden into courtroom facts. That was when Sabrina realized the truth. She was completely alone. Not a single soul in that room was on her side. The time for the verdict arrived. The judge ruled that although Sabrina's actions were driven by emotion, they had resulted in the loss of a fetus's life. Considering she had no prior criminal record, the court sentenced her to 1 year in prison, reduced by time served. The gavel came down. The sound echoed like a death bell for Sabrina's former life. 1 year behind bars meant losing everything: her reputation, her dignity, her freedom. In the gallery, Richard and Fiona clung to each other, pretending to grieve. But when Sabrina glanced their way, she caught the corner of Fiona's lips curling into a sly, triumphant smile. Before officers escorted Sabrina to the prison transport vehicle, a brief commotion broke out in the courthouse hallway. Richard requested permission to speak with his wife. The officers granted him 2 minutes. Richard leaned close to Sabrina's ear. There was no sadness left in his voice, only cold menace. He warned her not to cause trouble in prison. He told her he had already prepared documents transferring the company's assets into his name so business could continue while she was incarcerated. If Sabrina refused to sign later, he promised to make her life in prison a living hell. Sabrina looked at her husband calmly. She didn't answer. She didn't spit in his face, though she wanted to. Instead, she adjusted her shawl, straightened her back, and followed the officers without looking back. She refused to give the traitor the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Inside the prison transport van, Sabrina stared out at the streets of New York City through the barred window. The city that once felt like home now seemed foreign and hostile. She made a silent vow. The tears she held back today would become fuel for her revenge. She would not break, she would endure, and she would return to reclaim what was rightfully hers. The prison bus rolled through towering gates lined with barbed wire. The women's correctional facility loomed dark and oppressive. The stench of damp concrete and sweat greeted Sabrina as she stepped down. She was led through dim corridors and placed in an isolation cell for intake. A rough, worn prison uniform was handed to her. When the steel door slammed with a deafening clang, Sabrina sat on the cold floor. In the silence of the cramped cell, a single tear finally slid down her cheek. That was the last tear she would shed for her sorrow. From that moment on, her heart froze, sealing away all mercy for Richard Miller and Fiona Adams. This 1 year was not a punishment. It was preparation. The first days in prison felt like an endless nightmare. The air in the cell block was constantly damp, heavy with the smell of sweat and despair. The food was barely edible: hard rice, tasteless vegetables, meals swallowed more out of necessity than hunger. But Sabrina's greatest suffering was not physical. She was placed in a communal cell with inmates convicted of theft, fraud, and violent crimes. Their stares were predatory and intimidating as they sized her up, a woman in a shawl, clearly from an upper-class background and seemingly fragile. Her first night, Sabrina didn't sleep at all. She curled up on a thin, musty mattress, listening to harsh snores and distant shouts from other blocks. Every second reminded her of Richard's betrayal that had stranded her in this filthy place. Sabrina survived by becoming invisible. She avoided interaction, kept her head down, and completed her cleaning duties without complaint. But in prison, silence is often misunderstood as weakness. Senior inmates began harassing her, deliberately spilling her food, bumping into her during lineups. Sabrina endured it all, suppressing the fury burning in her chest. She knew that physical retaliation would only earn her injuries and a longer sentence. Unbeknownst to her, someone was watching. In the quietest corner of the prison cafeteria sat a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes as sharp as a hawk's. The other inmates called her Mrs. Regina Hart. No one dared disturb her table. Rumor had it she was a former elite investment banker who knew the financial secrets of powerful politicians. She had taken the fall in a massive money laundering scandal to protect her family, only to be betrayed in the end. One afternoon, a small commotion erupted in the prison library where Sabrina often sought refuge. Mrs. Hart was scolding another inmate who helped manage the prison cooperative's bookkeeping. The ledger was a mess, inventory numbers didn't match, and errors filled the pages. Mrs. Hart, a perfectionist, would not tolerate sloppy accounting. Sabrina hesitated, then stepped forward. Politely, softly, she asked permission to review the book. Mrs. Hart studied her suspiciously, then slid the thick ledger towards her. In just 10 minutes, Sabrina found the error. She explained clearly: mismatched entries between incoming and outgoing goods and an unbalanced trial balance. Her fingers flew across the old calculator with astonishing speed. Mrs. Hart fell silent. That moment changed Sabrina's life behind bars. Mrs. Hart saw what others had missed. Sabrina was not a pampered wife out of place. She was a brilliant woman with deep knowledge of business and accounting, a legacy inherited from her late father and buried for years because Richard had forbidden her involvement in the company. From that day on, Sabrina became Mrs. Hart's personal assistant. No one dared bother her again. Under Mrs. Hart's protection, Sabrina received a better mattress and cleaner food. More importantly, she received knowledge. During rest hours, Mrs. Hart taught her about legal loopholes, asset manipulation, and how to destroy an enemy's financial foundation without ever touching them physically. Sabrina absorbed every lesson like a parched sponge. Their bond deepened when Sabrina finally told the full story of Richard and Fiona's betrayal. Mrs. Hart listened quietly, her expression unreadable, but her eyes burned with restrained anger. She saw her own past reflected in Sabrina. Mrs. Hart then offered her an alliance. She still had a loyal right hand on the outside, a brilliant young attorney named Ethan Hack. Ethan could act as Sabrina's extension beyond prison walls. Sabrina accepted with deep gratitude. A week later, Ethan Pack was officially registered as Sabrina's new legal counsel. Their first meeting took place in the visitation room, separated by thick glass. Ethan was young, impeccably dressed, his gaze cold but respectful as Mrs. Hart introduced him. He skipped Pelletiers. Sabrina's body looked slightly thinner now, but her eyes were sharper, far more alive than before. She was no longer the victim crying in the corner of a cell. She was a hunter, silently sharpening her blade. Out in the free world, Richard Miller and Fiona Adams were enjoying the peak of their false glory. With Sabrina out of the way, Richard seized full control of the company's assets. He appointed himself as the supreme leader, replacing the board of directors with his own circle, friends who were incompetent but exceptionally skilled at flattery. Fiona was no less arrogant. She now lived in the grand mansion inherited from Sabrina's parents, acting as if she were the rightful lady of the house. Antique heirlooms belonging to Sabrina's late mother were pushed into storage or sold off, replaced with flashy, overpriced modern furniture that satisfied Fiona's need to show off. They felt untouchable. Convinced that Sabrina had been completely broken in prison, they believed she would never rise again. One bright morning, a correctional officer called out Sabrina's name. She had a visitor. Sabrina already knew who it would be. Only those two shameless people would dare show up on the anniversary of her marriage to Richard. Sure enough, through the waiting room door, Sabrina saw Richard in an expensive designer suit paid for with company money, while Fiona stood beside him in a luxurious dress, a branded handbag clinging possessively to Richard's arm. Fiona's belly was flat again, her face glowing with smug victory. They hadn't come out of kindness. They wanted Sabrina to see how happy they were while she suffered. They wanted tears, begging, rage, some kind of spectacle behind the glass. But their expectations were crushed instantly. Sabrina looked at the officer calmly and shook her head. Firmly, she stated that she refused the visit. The officer hesitated, confused, but Sabrina repeated herself clearly. She would not meet them. The officer delivered the message. The inmate named Sabrina Miller declined the visit. Richard's face flushed red with rage and humiliation, rejected by his own wife, now a prisoner. Fiona sneered loudly, making sure others could hear, mocking that Sabrina must be too ashamed and mentally broken to show her face. They left irritated, yet even more arrogant. To them, Sabrina's refusal was proof of total psychological defeat. Inside her cell, however, Sabrina was sitting peacefully, reading the Quran. The refusal was a calculated psychological move designed with Mrs. Regina Hart. By staying unseen, Sabrina allowed Richard and Fiona's imaginations to run wild. An invisible enemy is far more terrifying than one screaming in front of you. Blinded by arrogance, they mistook her silence for helplessness, and that made them careless. That week, a report from Ethan Hawke reached Sabrina. Richard had begun openly embezzling company funds to support Fiona's lavish lifestyle. They bought a new sports car, traveled overseas, and hosted extravagant parties, everything charged to the company's accounts. Month after month, the pattern continued. Whenever Richard came, usually to demand forged approval signatures or simply to show off, Sabrina always refused. 6 months passed, 8 months, then 9. Sabrina became a mystery to the outside world, like a ghost, forgotten yet haunting. Inside prison, Sabrina grew stronger. Together with Mrs. Regina Hart, Sabrina finalized a complex financial trap, an elegantly packaged fake investment scheme designed specifically to lure Richard's greed. The bait would be delivered through Ethan, posing as a foreign investor's representative. That night, Sabrina stood before the cell calendar, its surface filled with markings. She circled a date in red. 2 months left, her release date. Her gaze burned with intensity. Beside the calendar, she taped a small note listing the assets she would reclaim: her mother's house, her father's office building, the plantation land, and above all, her dignity. She smiled, not a sweet smile, a cold one promising a storm. "Enjoy the rest of your time, Richard, Fiona," she whispered to the night air slipping through the metal vent. "Eat well, laugh loudly, because the bill for all your crimes will come due the moment my feet step out of this gate." Her long silence was not surrender. It was the calm before she destroyed it all in a single day. The 9th month in prison brought unseen changes. Outside, the financial condition of her father's company began to crumble under Richard's control. He looked like a CEO, well-spoken, polished, but utterly incompetent in operational management. His habit of firing experienced employees who dared to criticize him and replacing them with useless friends began to show fatal consequences. Long-term projects stalled, loyal clients terminated contracts as service quality plummeted, cash flow hemorrhaged. But Richard's ego was too large to admit failure. He borrowed from small private lenders at high interest, robbing Peter to pay Paul just to maintain the illusion of wealth in front of Fiona and her socialite circle. That's when Ethan Hawke entered the game, not as Sabrina's lawyer, but under a flawless new identity. He introduced himself as a representative of a foreign investment consortium seeking a local partner for the largest luxury eco-resort development in Southeast Asia. His appearance was impeccable: tailored suit, luxury watch, gold-embossed business card. He arrived at Richard's office carrying a proposal with staggering numbers. Projected profits were so massive they made Richard's eyes widen. For a man drowning in debt, Ethan appeared like a savior from heaven. The meeting took place in the main conference room, now excessively redecorated by Fiona in a tasteless display of luxury. Richard sat upright, hiding his nerves, while Ethan calmly presented the fictional project. The consortium, Ethan explained, was willing to inject hundreds of millions of dollars, provided the local partner paid an upfront commitment fee. The amount demanded was steep: $3.2 million. Richard swallowed hard. He didn't have that kind of liquidity. Company accounts were nearly drained, and his personal assets weren't liquid enough. But Ethan played his psychology masterfully. He mentioned other competitors eager to take the deal if Richard hesitated. He even glanced at his watch, pretending he had another meeting lined up. Panic seized Richard. He asked for one day to decide. That night, the mansion inherited from Sabrina's parents witnessed a fierce and ambitious argument. Fiona pushed Richard relentlessly to take the deal. She already envisioned herself as the wife of a mega tycoon: broadcast wedding, elite parties, silencing everyone who had ever looked down on her. When Richard admitted they lacked cash, Fiona casually proposed a reckless idea: mortgage everything: the mansion they lived in, the strategic headquarters building, the inherited plantation land. According to Fiona's shallow logic, the mortgage would only be temporary. Once the investors' money arrived next month, they would redeem the assets and pocket massive profits. Richard, greedy and desperate to prove he was superior to Sabrina's late father, agreed. The next day, he called Ethan and confirmed his participation. Ethan connected him to a private financing institution for the asset mortgages. Naturally, that institution was part of Mrs. Hart's network, orchestrated quietly from inside prison. The loan process was fast and suspiciously easy, ensnaring Richard in debt before he could think twice. Inside her silent cell, Sabrina received smuggled documents via a bribed guard. Mortgage contracts, signed by Richard. Her fingers traced his signature. She felt no sadness seeing her childhood home and her father's office building put on the line. She felt relief. Those assets needed to leave Richard's hands to return to her, legally and painfully. Sabrina gave Ethan the approval signal. Within moments, $3.2 million were transferred from Richard to the foreign investment account, an account that would ultimately funnel back under Sabrina's control through layered legal structures. That night, Richard and Fiona celebrated at an upscale restaurant. They toasted with pomegranate juice, laughing about the future. Richard believed himself a business genius. Fiona praised him endlessly, calling him the next business king. They were drunk on illusion. They had no idea that the certificates for the roof over their heads and the office that fed them were now legally owned by creditors controlled by their enemy. They had just willingly placed their own necks into the noose Sabrina had prepared. Meanwhile, inside prison, Sabrina began counting down the days. She took extra care of her health, doing light exercises in her cell, treating her skin with whatever limited material she had, and deepening her spiritual practice. Her heart grew calmer with each passing day. The explosive rage that once consumed her during the early days of incarceration was gone. Mrs. Regina Hart watched her with quiet pride. The seasoned mentor knew her student was ready. During their final meeting in the prison library, Mrs. Hart clasped Sabrina's hands firmly. She reminded her never to look back once she walked out those gates. The best revenge, Mrs. Hart said, was not killing your enemies, but allowing them to live in lifelong poverty and regret, forced to watch the person they once destroyed rise far above them. Sabrina bowed her head respectfully and promised to execute the final plan with precision, leaving no room for error. The end of the 11th month flowed swiftly into the 12th. Outside, Richard Miller grew restless. The massive project promised by Ethan Hawke had yet to begin, always delayed by claims of complicated international licensing issues. Yet Ethan never failed to calm Richard with official-looking letters filled with dense bureaucratic language, all meticulously forged. Richard, already soaked too deep to retreat, dared not pull out. With $3.2 million already transferred, all he could do was wait anxiously while interest on the mortgaged assets began to accumulate. Fiona Adams, uninterested in technical matters, busied herself burning through the remaining company cash preparing for a grand celebration. Yes, they planned a lavish party on the very day Sabrina was released, not to welcome her, but to officially announce their engagement and flaunt their fabricated success directly in front of Sabrina's face. Invitations had been sent to business partners and the media alike. Unknowingly, they were building the stage for their own execution. Morning sunlight slipped through the narrow ventilation gap of Sabrina's cell, landing directly on her face. She had been awake since before dawn. Today was the day. 365 days of confinement were over. Sabrina folded her thin blanket with meticulous care. For the last time, she surveyed the narrow cell that had been her crucible for a year. On those walls, she had learned patience. On the cold floor, she had learned humility. And in the long, silent nights, she had learned how to become an undefeated woman. She put on the same long dress she had worn on the day she entered prison. It now felt slightly loose on her body. She had lost weight, but her posture was stronger, her body fitter, her presence firmer. The release process went smoothly. A correctional officer returned her confiscated belongings, her wallet, wristwatch, and a phone long drained of battery. Sabrina accepted them calmly, offering only a polite nod of thanks. As she walked toward the main gate, several inmates she had helped with legal matters waved at her behind the bars. Sabrina returned a faint smile. The most emotional moment came when she said goodbye to Mrs. Hart. The older woman said nothing, only tapped Sabrina's shoulder twice with firm reassurance. Her gaze spoke clearly. "Go, finish what we started." Sabrina kissed Mrs. Hart's hand respectfully, then turned and walked with unwavering steps toward the massive iron gate. It creaked loudly as it opened. The air outside felt different, fresher, freer, and filled with challenge. Sabrina stood on the sidewalk outside the prison, squinting against the bright morning sun. As expected, there was no Richard, no Fiona, no family waiting. Her phone vibrated as she powered it on. A message from Richard. It mocked her, claiming he was busy managing a business empire and had no time to pick up a former inmate. He attached the location of the hotel hosting the party that evening, adding a final line. "Come if you have the nerve and something decent to wear. You can eat the leftovers from our catering." Sabrina closed the message without expression. She wasn't hurt. She felt pity for her husband's stupidity. A sleek black sedan quietly pulled up in front of her. Not a taxi, but a brand new European luxury car with tinted windows. A uniformed driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Inside sat Ethan Hawke, smiling broadly as he welcomed both his client and his new boss. Sabrina slid into the car, sinking into soft leather seats, a stark contrast to the rigid prison bench. The scent of premium leather and subtle perfume calmed her nerves. Ethan handed her a thick folder. Everything was ready. The trap was sealed. The assets were legally secured behind the scenes, and Richard's party invitation was Sabrina's ticket to end it all. "Where to now, Miss Miller?" Ethan asked politely. "Back to your parents' house?" Sabrina shook her head slightly, adjusting her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her face looked tired, unadorned, faint dark circles under her eyes. Her shawl was worn. She would not enter a battlefield looking like a defeated woman. She needed to rise as a queen. "No," Sabrina said firmly. "Take me to my mother's boutique in South Jakarta, then to a private spa salon. I need 5 hours to prepare." Ethan nodded in understanding as the car glided away from the prison, carrying Sabrina away from a dark past and toward a future she would seize by force. At the exclusive boutique, Sabrina's arrival was met with warmth mixed with shock. The owner knew Sabrina's late mother well. They knew the news surrounding Sabrina's case, but they also knew the family's integrity. Sabrina asked for no discounts, no sympathy. She demanded their finest collection. She chose a haute couture gown in deep navy blue, a color symbolizing power, depth, and mystery. The finest silk draped flawlessly over her body, creating a silhouette that was both elegant and commanding. For her shawl, she selected a matching shade, fastened with a diamond brooch inherited from her mother, safely preserved by Ethan all this time. Then she spent hours in a private treatment room scrubbing away every trace of prison life, body treatments, hair care, professional makeup. Sabrina requested bold yet refined makeup. She wanted her eyes, sharp and piercing, to be the focal point. When she finally faced the great mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman staring back was no betrayed wife, no discarded prisoner. She radiated intimidation. Her chin was lifted, her gaze cold and unsheathed, her posture straight with absolute confidence. The transformation was complete. At 6 p.m., Jakarta's sky turned crimson-orange. Inside the car now headed toward the hotel hosting Richard and Fiona's party, Sabrina remained silent. Her hand gripped a leather handbag containing the only weapon she needed, a small flash drive loaded with digital forensic evidence and legal documents capable of collapsing Richard's fabricated business empire. Her heartbeat was steady. Fear was absent. She remembered Fiona's laughter when the judge sentenced her. She remembered Richard's threats in the courthouse corridor. Those memories were no longer wounds. They were fuel. "We've arrived, ma'am," the driver said. The car stopped at the lobby of a 5-star hotel, dazzling with excess. A red carpet stretched across the entrance. Guests in luxurious attire lined up to enter. Congratulatory flower boards displayed Richard and Fiona's names in bold gold letters. Sabrina inhaled deeply, then exhaled slowly. She adjusted her watch. "Ethan," she said before the door opened. "Yes, ma'am. Make sure our legal and security teams enter 5 minutes after I do. I want to savor their shocked expressions alone first." "Understood." The door opened. Sabrina stepped out. Camera flashes erupted immediately, journalists covering the party snapping photos of the elegant woman, unaware of her identity. Her high heels struck the marble floor in steady rhythm. Click, click, click. A death march for Richard and Fiona's arrogance. The party had just begun, and the true guest of honor had arrived. They looked like the happiest couple in the world, a couple who believed they had won everything: success, love, power, and had finally eliminated the one obstacle that once stood in their way. Richard Miller raised his glass of sparkling grape juice high, signaling for the guests' attention. The orchestra music slowly faded, replaced by the low hum of the microphone in his hand. The ballroom fell silent. All eyes turned toward the stage. Richard began his speech in a loud, carefully crafted, authoritative tone. He spoke about the company's future vision, about how he had single-handedly pulled the corporation out of difficult times, when in truth he was the very cause of its downfall. He spoke of his true love for Fiona Adams, praising her unwavering support. Then he took a thinly veiled jab at his past, saying he was grateful to have freed himself from a parasite that had long hindered his success, an unmistakable reference to Sabrina. Some guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few whispered among themselves, criticizing how tasteless it was to mock a former wife who had spent the last year in prison. But Richard didn't care. He was intoxicated by false praise. Just as Richard was about to announce the official date of his wedding to Fiona, bang! The massive double doors at the back of the ballroom burst open with a forceful shove. The heavy hinges groaned loudly, slicing through the silence. Every head turned in unison toward the entrance. Light from the corridor flooded in, forming the silhouette of a woman standing tall at the threshold. At first, no one recognized her. The stage spotlights were blinding. But then, click. Click. The sound of high heels echoed across the marble floor, steady and intimidating. Click, click. It sounded like the ticking of a death clock for the party. The woman stepped out of the shadows. She wore an elegant deep navy gown, modest in cut, yet radiating undeniable authority. A silk shawl in a matching shade framed her flawless face, accentuating sharp cheekbones and eyes that cut like drawn blades. There was no trace left of the broken woman who had cried in court a year ago, no trace of the unkempt prisoner. This was Sabrina, in her strongest form, forged by betrayal, cooled by calculated revenge. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "That's Sabrina. Wasn't she in prison? My God, she looks incredible. She looks far more refined than Fiona." The murmurs buzzed like bees, drowning out Richard's speech. On stage, Richard squinted. His heart seemed to stop when he recognized her face. The glass in his hand nearly slipped. The redness of celebration drained from his face, replaced by a sickly pallor. Sensing something wrong, Fiona turned. Her eyes widened in shock. Envy and hatred surged instantly as she took in Sabrina's commanding appearance, so much more striking than her own. She felt threatened. Fiona hissed something into Richard's ear, urging him to have the woman thrown out. Snapping out of his daze, Richard forced himself to regain control. He could not appear weak in front of investors and business partners. His image had to be protected. "Security!" Richard shouted into the microphone, his voice trembling despite his effort to sound firm. "Remove this woman. This is a private event. A former inmate is not welcome here." He emphasized former inmate deliberately, hoping to humiliate Sabrina publicly. But Sabrina didn't flinch. She didn't stop walking. Her gaze was locked straight onto Richard and Fiona on the stage. As hotel security attempted to move in, several tall men in black suits suddenly appeared behind Sabrina, her private security detail, arranged by Ethan Hawke. The guests held their breath. This real-life drama was far more captivating than any scripted series. Sabrina walked calmly through the crowd. People instinctively stepped aside, parting for her as though she were a queen walking through a sea of humanity. Her presence was so commanding that no one dared block her path. Occasionally, she offered a faint, lethal smile to a few of her late father's former business associates, the ones who had remained silent when she was imprisoned. They lowered their heads in shame, unable to meet her eyes. Sabrina stopped directly in front of Richard. She looked up at Richard and Fiona, who suddenly appeared small despite standing higher. Only a few meters separated them, yet the gulf in class and power felt immense. "What are you doing here, you crazy woman?" Fiona hissed without a microphone, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Are you here to beg for money or to eat leftover catering? Leave, you're ruining my party." Sabrina chuckled softly, a light laugh, cold enough to make Fiona's skin crawl. Without raising her voice, Sabrina ascended the stage steps with graceful confidence. Richard instinctively stepped back, cowardice taking over. Sabrina didn't attack them physically. She reached for the spare microphone resting on the side table. She turned it on. A brief feedback screech filled the room before silence returned. "Good evening, everyone," Sabrina said calmly, her voice poised, refined, and impeccably educated, a stark contrast to Richard's earlier panicked shouting. "My husband, my ex-husband, Richard Miller, claims I'm an uninvited guest. That's amusing, because in fact, I am the true host here tonight." Richard laughed nervously, trying to salvage control. "Host? You've lost your mind from prison, Sabrina. You have nothing left. All the assets have changed hands." Sabrina tilted her head, smiling faintly. "You're right, Richard. All the assets have changed hands." She paused. "The only question is, whose hands?" She gestured toward the entrance. Ethan Hawke entered with confident strides, carrying a leather briefcase. Behind him followed 2 police officers and 3 men in dark suits bearing the insignia of a major Western financial authority. Richard's face turned ashen. He recognized Ethan, the foreign investor who had promised the billion-dollar project. Why was he here, with police and bankers? "Allow me to clarify," Sabrina said smoothly, pointing to Ethan. "You may know him as Mr. Edward from a Singapore-based consortium. His real name is Ethan Hawke, my personal attorney." She let the words sink in. "And this hotel, the building you are standing in, celebrating in tonight, completed a legal ownership transfer 10 minutes ago." Gasps filled the room. "So technically, Richard, you're hosting a party on my property without permission." The ballroom erupted. Cameras flashed wildly as journalists scrambled to capture every second. Richard stood frozen, his sluggish mind struggling to process the revelation. Fiona screamed hysterically, accusing Sabrina of lying. But Sabrina wasn't finished. "That," she said calmly, "was merely the appetizer." Panic spread across Richard's face like fast-acting poison. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead, washing away the thin layer of powder he wore. He looked at Ethan desperately, hoping for an explanation, hoping this was some elaborate prank. Ethan's professional, emotionless gaze crushed that hope. Ethan stepped on the stage, not as a business partner, but as Sabrina's loyal ally. He opened his briefcase, took out a laptop, and connected it to the projector linked to the massive screen behind the stage. The pre-wedding photos of Richard and Fiona, fake Paris backdrops edited from a local studio, flickered and disappeared. A financial flowchart appeared instead. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sabrina said, her voice now razor-sharp, "you may be wondering how a former inmate, released just today, can claim ownership of this building. Allow me to offer you a brief lesson in business and karma." On the screen appeared clear financial records. A transfer of $3.2 million made by Richard 1 month earlier. The title read in bold letters, "Investment Commitment Transfer. Evidence." 1 month ago, this Honorable Mr. Miller was eager to secure a fictional project offered by my attorney. Blinded by greed, he mortgaged my parents' family home, the corporate headquarters, and our plantation land to a private financial institution. The screen shifted again, displaying mortgage deeds and loan agreements. "What he didn't know," Sabrina said calmly, "is that the private financing firm providing that—" "There is no resort project, Richard," Sabrina Miller said sharply. "It never existed. It was bait, plastic bait for greedy fish, and you swallowed it whole, hook, line, and sinker." Ethan Hawke pressed another key on his laptop. The giant screen now displayed the real-time status of Richard Miller's personal and corporate bank accounts. Red numbers. Balance, $0.00. Status, frozen by financial authorities. "Based on the investment agreement you signed without reading carefully," Ethan spoke in his deep, commanding baritone, "if the local partner is proven to have manipulated financial reports, which we have documented for over a year, the investor has the legal right to terminate the partnership unilaterally and seize all pledged assets as liquidated damages." Ethan gestured toward several men standing below the stage. "These gentlemen represent the Federal Debt Recovery Agency handling the remainder of your personal liabilities. Since all your assets have already been seized by my client as penalties, you are now officially declared insolvent, bankrupt, broke." Fiona Adams screamed hysterically. She rushed toward the projection screen, pounding it with her fists as if sheer desperation could turn those zeros back into millions of dollars. "This is a lie! It's all a lie! Richard, do something! Don't just stand there like an idiot!" she shrieked, violently shaking him. Her designer gown now looked ridiculous amid the chaos. Richard shoved Fiona away. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he pulled out his phone and opened his mobile banking app. Empty. All accounts blocked. Credit cards declined. Email notifications flooded in. Asset seizure after asset seizure. The sports car he bragged about, the luxury apartment he bought for Fiona, gone. All of it. In seconds. "What did you do to me?" Richard roared at Sabrina, veins bulging in his neck as he lunged forward. Before he could reach her, Sabrina's bodyguards intercepted him, twisting his arm behind his back and forcing him to his knees. Richard groaned in pain. The image was painfully symbolic, the false king kneeling before the true queen. Sabrina looked down at him coldly, no pity, no hesitation. "I only reclaimed what was rightfully mine, Richard. My mother's house, my father's company, and my dignity. You were nothing more than a puppet I allowed to play briefly in my kingdom, and now your game is over." The engagement party collapsed into total chaos. Servers froze mid-service. The orchestra fell silent. Guests whispered in panic, some hurriedly leaving to avoid legal fallout, while others pulled out their phones to live stream Richard's downfall. Within minutes, hashtags like Richard Miller Karma and Fiona Adams Exposed were trending. Fiona collapsed onto the floor, wailing, not out of remorse, but from the realization she would never become a billionaire's wife. She glared at Sabrina with pure hatred. "You demon woman! You planned all this from prison! You're evil!" Sabrina turned to her, smiling wider. "Evil? Oh no, Fiona, this is called strategy. Evil is framing another pregnant woman to cover up your own miscarriage." She paused, then nodded at Ethan. "And speaking of that, you might want to save your strength. I have one final video that will make you wish you'd never been born." Ethan nodded and prepared the final file. Richard, still restrained, looked up in terror. He thought he had reached rock bottom, only to realize Sabrina was still digging deeper. The screen went dark, then lit up again. CCTV footage appeared, time-stamped clearly. A private, luxury medical clinic, 2 days before the mall accident. The footage showed Fiona Adams walking out of a consultation room, no signs of pain. Instead, she was angrily arguing on the phone. Ethan synced an intercepted audio recording obtained through Mrs. Regina Hart's extensive network. Fiona's voice echoed clearly. She complained about severe bleeding caused by high-dose weight loss pills taken to maintain her figure for Richard. She admitted the doctor had confirmed the fetus could not be saved and that she was scheduled for a curettage the next day. Then came the line that froze the room. She said she would delay the procedure and find a way to pin the miscarriage on Sabrina Miller so Richard would hate his wife and divorce her faster. Silence. A suffocating graveyard silence. All eyes turned to Fiona, disgusted, horrified. The truth was naked and brutal. Fiona hadn't lost the baby because of Sabrina. She killed her own unborn child for vanity, then used the corpse as a weapon to destroy another woman's life. Ethan displayed one final document: authentic hospital records. Diagnosis: incomplete abortion caused by chemical substance ingestion. The doctor who falsified the original medical report has now surrendered the authentic records, Ethan announced, after being warned of license revocation and criminal prosecution. That document was the final nail in Fiona's lies. Richard snapped. With animal fury, he broke free and lunged at Fiona, not to strike her, but to grab her shoulders and shake her violently. "Why?" he screamed. "Why would you lie about my child?" He realized too late. He had destroyed a loyal wife, lost his inheritance, sacrificed his honor, all for a woman who had manipulated him from the beginning. Sabrina watched quietly. No triumph, only relief. The weight of a year-long accusation, baby killer, finally lifted. She took the microphone one last time. "Lies may run fast," Sabrina said calmly, "but the truth always waits at the finish line." "What you see tonight is not my revenge," she concluded. "It is simply the harvest of what they planted themselves." Fiona collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably, her mask shattered forever. Richard stepped back, staring at his own hands hollow. Then he looked at Sabrina Miller, radiant, untouchable. Only then did he understand. He had thrown away a diamond to chase shards of glass that cut him to pieces. Regret came too late, far too late, and it hurt far more than bankruptcy itself. Amid the emotional chaos, the piercing wail of police sirens echoed through the walls of the Broome Hotel ballroom, growing louder as they approached the lobby. The sound announced that the final chapter of their downfall was about to be enforced, this time by the law. The approaching sirens sparked fresh panic on the faces of Richard Miller and Fiona Adams. Both of them knew all too well that this was no longer part of Sabrina Miller's carefully orchestrated spectacle. This was the real consequence of the mountain of legal crimes they had committed. The ballroom doors opened once more. Not forced open, but pushed wide with authority by a full unit of uniformed police officers. They marched in with firm, synchronized steps, cutting through the crowd as guests quickly parted to make way. The lavish party that had once been filled with music and artificial laughter had now transformed into an active crime scene. At the front of the formation stood a senior police officer holding 2 arrest warrants. He stepped onto the stage and approached Richard, who no longer had the strength to resist. In a loud, formal voice, the officer read out his legal rights and the charges against him. Richard Miller was placed under arrest on suspicion of corporate tax evasion, falsification of banking documents, and large-scale investment fraud. The financial crime evidence compiled over the past year by Mrs. Regina Hart from inside prison had been formally submitted to the district attorney's office earlier that morning by Ethan Hawke. Richard was not only bankrupt, he was about to spend a very long time behind bars, much longer than the single year Sabrina had once endured. When the cold steel handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists, Richard could only lower his head in defeat. His shoulders slumped, symbolizing the total collapse of the arrogance he once wore so proudly. Fiona's fate was no less tragic. A female police officer approached her and read out her arrest warrant, listing multiple charges: perjury, defamation, and falsification of medical records. Fiona immediately went hysterical. She struggled violently, screaming that she was innocent, that she was the real victim. She attempted to flee the stage, but the officer swiftly restrained her, twisting her arm behind her back and locking the handcuffs in place. Her expensive sequin-covered evening gown now looked absurd as she was dragged away. One of her high heels slipped off, forcing her to limp helplessly. The sight of Fiona Adams being dragged away while screaming uncontrollably was recorded by hundreds of smartphones. The footage would become a permanent digital record of her disgrace. As they were escorted past Sabrina, who stood calmly near the podium, Richard suddenly stopped. He resisted the officers guiding him. With tear-filled eyes, he looked at Sabrina Miller. Then, shockingly, he dropped to his knees at her feet. Despite his cuffed hands, he sobbed, begging for forgiveness in a hoarse voice. He claimed it was all a moment of weakness. He said he still loved her. He pleaded for her to withdraw the charges. He even dared to bring up their past, sweet memories of their marriage and promises once made by Sabrina's father. It was a pitiful sight. A man who an hour earlier believed himself to be king of the world, now groveling like the lowest beggar at the feet of the woman he had once sent to prison. Sabrina looked down at the crown of Richard's bowed head. She stepped back, lifting the hem of her dress so it would not be touched by his false tears. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes were unwavering. In a loud voice, loud enough for everyone to hear, Sabrina said that the door of forgiveness might be open before God, but the door of justice in this world must still run its course. She reminded Richard of the night she herself had been dragged from her own home by police, while he watched with a cold smile. Now, she said, the wheel has turned. She made it clear she would never withdraw the charges. She wanted Richard to experience every second behind bars, to reflect on how expensive betrayal truly is. After that, Sabrina signaled to the officers to take him away. Richard screamed her name as he was dragged out of the room, his voice slowly fading down the hotel corridor. Once the 2 parasites were removed, the room gradually fell silent, though whispers still buzzed through the crowd. Ethan Hawke approached Sabrina and quietly informed her that everything was complete. The hotel, the corporate assets, and the entire family fortune were now legally restored to her control. Sabrina nodded, exhausted but relieved. She had no desire to remain in a place saturated with hypocrisy. Ignoring the guests who now tried to approach her with shallow apologies and forced politeness, Sabrina stepped down from the stage. She walked through the crowd with her head held high, not looking left or right. She left behind untouched food, extravagant decorations, and a celebration that now felt hollow. Outside the hotel lobby, the cool night air greeted her skin. Sabrina took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of true freedom, clean, sweet, and unburdened. She entered her waiting luxury car. She instructed the driver not to take her back to the grand house she had just reclaimed. She wasn't ready to return there yet. Instead, she asked to be driven to the city's central mosque. Ethan Hawke smiled faintly, admiring his client's calm spirit, untouched by worldly triumph. The car glided through the city streets. Sabrina gazed at the city lights through the window, remembering her darkest days in prison, remembering the face of Mrs. Regina Hart, her mentor. She silently vowed to use her power and wealth to help reopen Mrs. Hart's legal case. Prison had changed her. She was no longer the naive, fragile Sabrina. She was now resilient, intelligent, and unbreakable. Yet, beneath her armor, she remained a servant of God, fully aware where gratitude belonged. At the mosque, Sabrina stepped out and performed ablution with cool water, washing away the remnants of her evening makeup. On the quiet prayer mat, she bowed in gratitude for a long time. Her shoulders trembled, not from sadness, but from overwhelming emotion. She wept, releasing everything she had held inside for a year. In her prayer, she whispered thanks to God for giving her the strength to endure and to reclaim her life in such a beautiful way. When she arose and stepped outside, the sky above was clear, filled with stars. Sabrina adjusted her shawl and smiled sincerely for the first time since the storm had struck her life. She was ready to begin anew. A life as a free woman, a corporate leader, the guardian of her family's legacy. Richard Miller and Fiona Adams were nothing more than a buried past. Tomorrow belonged to her. Sabrina walked toward her car with a light heart. The dark chapter had ended, closed with dignity, justice, and absolute victory. A year of silent endurance had been paid in full in a single, unforgettable night. And now Sabrina Miller's true life had just begun.